The kitchen light was humming the way it always did in winter, that low flicker that my husband had promised to fix for 15 years and never did. I noticed it because I notice everything now. That night, my son sat across from me at the table where he had eaten every Christmas dinner of his life, and he was not eating. He was watching me. I asked him if the stew was too salty. He said no. I asked if something was wrong at work. He said everything was fine. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine, and that is when I knew something was very wrong, because my son is not a man who reaches across tables. He is not cold, but he is private the way his father was private, the kind of man who shows love by shoveling your driveway before you wake up, not by holding your hand at dinner. "Mom," he said, "I need you to check your bank account tomorrow morning." I told him I didn't understand. He said he transferred money into my account. I asked how much. He looked down at his bowl and said, "Everything." I laughed. I thought he was joking. He did not laugh back. He told me the amount. I set down my spoon. The number he said was not the kind of number you say at a kitchen table in Sudbury, Ontario, not the kind of number I had ever associated with my son, who grew up sharing a bedroom with his cousin and wearing secondhand hockey skates until he was 16. He had done well for himself, I knew that. He had built something real out west with the tech company he'd started, and it had grown in ways I didn't fully understand. But that number? I asked him why. He said, "Just keep it safe, don't tell anyone." I asked him again. He squeezed my hand and stood up and said he had to drive back that night, back to Vancouver, back to his wife in the house I had visited exactly twice. I told him it was late and he should sleep over. He said he couldn't. He hugged me at the door the way you hug someone when you are trying to memorize them, longer than usual, both arms, his chin on top of my head. I stood on the porch and watched his rental car back out of my driveway. The snow had started again. The tail lights disappeared at the end of the street, and I stood there longer than I should have, in my socks, in the cold. He called me once from the highway. He said he just wanted to hear my voice. I talked to him about nothing, about the neighbor's new dog, about whether I should repaint the hallway. He laughed at one point, a real laugh, the kind that sounds like his father's laugh, and then he said he had to focus on the road and he'd call me in the morning. He did not call me in the morning. His wife called me. Her voice was controlled, the way it always was, smooth and managed, like someone who had thought about how they would sound before they dialed. She said there had been an accident. She said it very quickly. She said he had pulled over on the highway and that by the time anyone found him, he was already gone. She said it was his heart. My son was 51 years old. He ran half marathons. He had never had a problem with his heart in his life. I don't remember exactly what happened in the next few hours. I remember my neighbor coming over because I must have called her. I remember her making tea. I didn't drink. I remember the light in the kitchen still humming. What I did not do in those first hours was tell anyone about the money. I don't know why exactly. It was not a calculated decision. It was something quieter than that, something instinctive. I thought about his face at the table. I thought about the way he had said, "Don't tell anyone," like it was the most important part of what he was saying. More important than the number, more important than the explanation he hadn't given me. I thought about him hugging me at the door. I kept it to myself. I flew out to Vancouver 4 days later for the service. My daughter-in-law had arranged everything already. That surprised me. How fast it had all been arranged, but I told myself people grieve differently and I was not in a state to judge anyone. The service was at a venue I had never heard of, not a church, not the funeral home chapel I had expected. It was a rented event space near the waterfront, catered, 60 or 70 people I mostly didn't recognize. His wife stood at the front in a dress that looked expensive and received condolences with her hand pressed to her chest. She had not called me to ask what I wanted. She had not called to ask what music he would have wanted, or whether there was a reading, or whether I might want to say something. I found that out when I arrived and asked the woman at the door for the program. My name was not in it. I sat in the third row because the first two were reserved for her family. Her parents, her brothers, their wives. Her mother did not look at me once during the service. Her father shook my hand briefly and looked over my shoulder while he did it. My son's ashes were on a table with flowers I had not chosen. I went back to my hotel that night and sat on the edge of the bed and let myself cry properly for the first time. I am 63 years old and I have buried a husband and two parents, and I know that grief does not ask your permission and it does not follow a schedule. But there was something else underneath the grief that night. Something sharp and alert that kept interrupting the crying. Some part of my brain that was still pulling at a thread. He had transferred everything. He had driven away in the snow. He had called me to hear my voice. He had known. I don't know how I knew that he had known, but I did. A mother knows. I have known this man since before he had a name. I have watched him lose and win and hide things and process things in silence the way his father did. And that dinner, that hand over mine, that hug at the door, that was not a man who was afraid he might be getting sick. That was a man who was saying goodbye. I did not sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I opened my laptop and logged into the bank account. The transfer was there, every cent. I sat with that for a long time. 2 days after the service, my daughter-in-law called. She asked if I was still in Vancouver. I said yes. She said she'd like to meet, that there were some things that needed to be sorted out regarding the estate. I said I understood. She said she could come to my hotel, or I could come to the house, whichever was easier for me. Something in her voice was careful, in a way I could feel through the phone. I said I would come to the house. I should not have gone alone. I know that now. But I am 63 and I grew up in a family where you handle your own problems, and I suppose I walked into that house thinking this was a family matter that would be resolved like a family matter. I was wrong about what kind of meeting it was. When I arrived, her parents were there, and a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be their family lawyer. I sat down. I did not show anything on my face. I learned that from my mother, who could receive bad news at a dinner party without changing her expression by a millimeter. The lawyer placed a document on the coffee table. He said it was a letter of intent, that my son had discussed with his wife a plan to consolidate their assets under a joint family trust, and that he had expressed his intention to designate his wife and her family as primary beneficiaries in any updated documents. He said the transfer I had received appeared to be an error, possibly made under duress or confusion, and that they were prepared to give me time to return the funds voluntarily before pursuing a formal legal claim. I looked at the document. I did not touch it. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She was sitting with her hands folded, watching me with an expression that was carefully arranged to look like grief, but with something else entirely underneath. I had seen that expression before, the first time I met her, and I had told myself I was being an unfair mother-in-law, that I was projecting, that not every woman who married your son was a threat. I had talked myself out of what I saw in her eyes at that first meeting. I was not talking myself out of it now. I said, very quietly, that I would not be signing anything that day. I said that if they had a legal claim, they were welcome to pursue it through the appropriate channels, and that my own legal counsel would be in touch. I stood up. I said I was sorry for their loss because he had been their son-in-law, and whatever had happened, that was still true. Her mother started to say something. I walked to the door. I called a lawyer before I was back at the hotel. A good one, someone my accountant in Sudbury had recommended years ago for a property matter. The kind of person who doesn't panic and doesn't waste words. I told her everything. She told me not to move any of the money, not to communicate with them again without her present, and to courier her copies of everything I had. What I had at that point was not much. I had the bank transfer record. I had the memory of dinner. What I found 6 weeks later changed everything. My daughter-in-law had sent a box of his personal things to my house in Sudbury. Books, mostly, and a few framed photos. and a small wooden box that had been on his desk at the office. I almost set it aside without opening it. I was tired. I was still in that phase of grief where objects belonging to the person feel radioactive, where you can't look at a handwriting sample without having to sit down. But something made me open it. Inside, under a layer of business cards and a broken watch band, was a notebook. Soft cover, navy blue, the kind you get at any drugstore. His handwriting on the inside cover. I sat down on my kitchen floor and read it. He had started writing in it 8 months before he died. The early entries were vague, frustrations about the direction of the company, concerns about decisions being made without him, money he couldn't account for in the quarterly reports. Then it got more specific. He had discovered that his wife, with her father's involvement, had been systematically moving assets out of the company through a series of numbered corporations registered in Alberta, small amounts at first, then larger. He had confronted her. She had told him he was imagining things. He had gone to an external accountant. The external accountant had confirmed what he suspected. He wrote, in one entry near the end, "She smiled at me when I showed her the report." Not a guilty smile. A smile like she was deciding something. He had been to see a doctor 3 months before he died. He wrote that he had started experiencing headaches and fatigue that he couldn't explain. He had mentioned to the doctor that he'd had 2 episodes where he felt the room tilting, once at dinner and once at work. The doctor had ordered tests. He wrote that the tests had come back normal. In the last entry, written 2 days before the night he came to my house, he wrote this: "I don't know what they're capable of. I know I need to move the money before I do anything else. I know Mom will keep it safe. She's the only one I've completely trust." I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time. Then I got up and called my lawyer. She contacted the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. The notebooks, along with the financial records my son had photographed and stored in a cloud folder with my email as the recovery address, something I hadn't even known existed until my lawyer walked me through it, were turned over as evidence. The investigation took several months. I was not allowed to know most of what was happening during that time. I live with uncertainty badly. I am a person who needs to be doing something, and for those months all I could do was wait and trust people I had just met to handle something that was the most important thing in my life. What they found was significant. The asset transfers had been ongoing for 4 years. The numbered corporations were real. There was also a life insurance policy, a large one taken out 18 months before my son died, with his wife as sole beneficiary, where the signature on the application did not match any other instance of his signature in any document they examined. A handwriting expert confirmed it. There was no conclusive determination made about the cause of my son's death. The RCMP told me that his death had been certified as cardiac, and with no autopsy, something his wife had declined on his behalf, citing his wishes. Before I had even been contacted, there was no physical evidence that could be tested. I had to make peace with not knowing. That is something I am still working on. What there was evidence for was fraud. Significant, documented, multi-year fraud involving both my daughter-in-law and her father. Her mother and brothers were cleared of knowing involvement, which surprised me slightly and didn't surprise me at all, because her mother had the look of someone who had spent decades not knowing things that were right in front of her. My daughter-in-law was charged. Her father was charged. The proceedings took a long time in the way Canadian proceedings always do, and I will not sit here and pretend I wasn't frustrated every time my lawyer called with another delay, but eventually there was a resolution. Guilty pleas, in the end. Sentences that I am not fully satisfied with and that my lawyer told me were realistic given the evidence available. They are served or being served, and the fraudulent insurance claim was denied, and the asset transfers were subject to civil recovery proceedings that are still ongoing as I tell this. The money my son transferred to me that night is mine. My lawyer confirmed it. The transfer was legitimate, documented, made by a man who was of sound mind and who had every right to do with his assets as he chose. I did not move it for a long time. Then I set up a scholarship in his name at the university in Sudbury, where he had done his first 2 years before transferring to UBC. I kept enough to stop worrying about things I used to worry about. The rest I used carefully, in ways I think he would recognize. I still have the notebook. I keep it in the wooden box from his desk, the one that came in the parcel from Vancouver. Some nights I take it out and I don't open it. I just hold it, the soft cover and the worn spine. He touched this every time he wrote in it. That is something I have, and no one can take it back. The kitchen light stopped humming in April. My neighbor's son-in-law came over and replaced the ballast, and it cost $40 and took 20 minutes. I stood in the kitchen afterward and looked at the table where my son and I had our last meal together in the light that now worked properly, and I let myself feel all of it at once. He knew what he was walking back into. He came to Sudbury anyway. He sat across from me and put his hand over mine and made sure I would be okay. That is who my son was. That is what I carry. I think about the notebook a lot, not what's written in it. I know those words by heart now, but the act of writing it. My son sat somewhere alone and chose to put things down on paper instead of calling me, instead of going to the police, instead of doing any of the things I wished he had done. For a long time, I was angry about that. I wanted to shake him and ask why he hadn't just told me, why he had carried it quietly the way he carried everything, why he had chosen to protect me with silence instead of trusting me with the truth while he was still here. But I've come to understand something about the way he handled it, and it says everything about who he was. He didn't just transfer the money. He documented. He photographed records. He set up a recovery account he knew I could access. He thought through every step with a clear head while living inside a situation that would have made most people panic or shut down entirely. That kind of thinking, careful, methodical, not letting fear win over reason. That's not something you stumble into. That's something built slowly, over a lifetime of paying attention and refusing to be sloppy when it counts. And his wife and her father were the opposite of that. They were people who confused cleverness with intelligence. They had planned for years, moved money carefully, covered their tracks, and then the moment they thought they'd won, they walked into my house with a lawyer and a letter and assumed I would fold. They had underestimated what it looks like when someone does the right thing without an audience. They had never considered that my son's final act of love might also be his most precise act of documentation. That's what greed does, in my experience. It makes you assume everyone else is as transactional as you are. It makes you read every situation as a negotiation, and it makes you blind to the people who are simply trying to do right by the ones they love. I'm 63. I've made mistakes in my life that I'd take back if I could. I've also stood in rooms where the easier thing was to say nothing, and I've said something anyway, and it cost me, and I'd do it again. What my son's story confirmed for me, what I carry with me now in a way I didn't quite before, is that integrity is not a personality trait. It's a practice. You build it in small moments, in the choices no one sees, in the decision to write things down honestly in a Navy notebook even when you're frightened, even when you don't know how it ends. My son did not survive what was done to him. That is a fact I will live with for the rest of my life, and there is no resolution that changes it. But the choices he made, the way he used his last clear-headed weeks, those held. They held against lawyers and forged signatures and people who had spent years telling themselves they deserved what wasn't theirs. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. I kept enough of his money to stop worrying. I gave the rest somewhere it would keep building something. And I get up every morning and I try to be someone who, if I had to, could write honestly in a notebook at the end of things and not be ashamed of what I'd put down. That's what he left me, beyond the money, a standard to hold myself to.